A horse kicks up a cloud of ochre dust against a relentlessly blue Texas sky. In the saddle sits a young woman, her back straight, her hands holding the reins with a novice's terrified grip. Her uniform is simple, a faded khaki, but the insignia on her collar, though removed, has left a faint shadow. The eagle of the German Luftwaffe. Around her, men in wide-brimmed hats and worn denim shirts shout encouragement, their accents thick and unfamiliar. One of them, a lanky man with lines etched around his eyes from a lifetime of squinting into the sun, adjusts her stirrup. "Don't fight her," he drawls. "Just feel the rhythm. She'll carry you if you trust her." The year is 1944. The bloodiest war in human history is raging across the globe. And here, in the heart of America, a German prisoner of war is being taught how to be a cowgirl. This scene should not exist. It defies every rule of war, every expectation of captivity. These women were cogs in the Nazi war machine. They were the enemy. By all logic, they should have been behind barbed wire, broken by labor, fear, and humiliation. Instead, they were given saddles, not shackles. They were offered trust, not terror. This strange, forgotten chapter of World War II is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a story that forces us to ask a profound question. What is the true measure of a nation's power? Is it found in the shock and awe of its military might, or in the quiet, unshakable confidence of its ideals? This is not a story about the kindness of a few ranchers. It is the story of a deliberate, calculated strategy of psychological warfare, one waged not with bombs and bullets, but with beef stew, Coca-Cola, and a revolutionary idea that the most effective way to defeat an enemy's ideology is to treat them with a dignity their own system would never allow. This is the story of how America's greatest weapon wasn't a secret project developed in a lab, but an act of radical decency that would plant the seeds of a lasting peace in the heart of its most bitter enemies. To understand the profound shock of that Texas morning, we must first rewind and descend into the world these women came from. A world of iron, concrete, and fear. For 24-year-old Lieselotte Minhart, a former Luftwaffe radio operator, reality was a meticulously constructed cage of propaganda. Since childhood, she and every other German had been fed a steady diet of national superiority and visceral hatred, crafted by the masterful hand of Joseph Goebbels. The enemy, they were told, was not just a foreign army. It was a subhuman force. The Soviets were Bolshevik beasts. The British were decadent aristocrats. But the Americans were something else entirely. They were a nation of mongrels, a chaotic mix of races and criminals, a society of gangsters and factory slaves motivated only by money and machines. Propaganda posters depicted American GIs as grotesque caricatures, leering monsters with dollar signs in their eyes, clutching stolen goods while trampling on European culture. Radio broadcasts relentlessly hammered home the message: America had no soul, no honor, no history. Its democracy was a sham, its freedom a lie, its people degenerate. For the soldiers and auxiliary corps of the Wehrmacht, this wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a survival guide. Officers warned their troops that capture by the Americans was a fate worse than death. The stories, whispered in barracks and printed in official pamphlets, were terrifyingly specific. Captured Germans, they claimed, were starved for sport. They were used for horrific medical experiments. They were forced to dig their own graves under a merciless sun before being shot. For women like Lieselotte, who served in the Luftwaffenhelferinnen, the female auxiliary corps, the warnings were even more monstrous. They were told they would be treated as spoils of war, their dignity stripped away by the undisciplined and immoral soldiers of a corrupt nation. This fear was a weapon forged by the Nazi state to ensure its soldiers would fight to the last man. It was designed to make surrender unthinkable, and it worked. When Lieselotte was captured near Cherbourg in the chaotic aftermath of the Normandy invasion, that fear was the only thing she had left. As she was herded onto a Liberty ship with hundreds of other prisoners, the metallic tang of dread filled her mouth. The journey across the Atlantic was a nightmare of uncertainty, crammed into the dark, suffocating holds of a cargo vessel, tossed by the endless waves. The only thing that kept them going were the horror stories they told each other, reinforcing the official narrative. They were sailing toward a monster. The train ride across America only amplified their terror. Through the grimy windows, they saw a landscape so vast, so empty, it seemed alien. It was a continent, not a country, and with every clack of the wheels on the track, every mile that plunged them deeper into this strange new world, the fear grew. They were being taken somewhere remote, somewhere they could disappear without a trace. When the train finally hissed to a stop and the trucks arrived to take them to their final destination, a place called Amarillo, Texas, Lieselotte and the other women braced themselves. They had been taught their entire lives to expect the whip, the shout, the rifle butt. They had been programmed to see a savage. The myth was complete. The stage was set for a collision with a reality so powerful, so utterly unexpected, that it would shatter everything they believed to be true. The truck engines coughed, sputtered, and fell silent. The only sounds were the buzz of cicadas and a low wind whispering through mesquite trees. For a long moment, nobody moved. Inside the truck, the German women sat in a pool of shared dread, the Texas sun beating down on the canvas cover. This was it. The final act. The rumors, the posters, the officers' warnings all culminated in this moment. Lieselotte squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white. The truck doors creaked open. A silhouette appeared, framed against a blindingly bright sky. She braced for the guttural shout of a guard, the cold steel of a gun barrel. Instead, a calm voice spoke, its rhythm slow and strange. "Ma'am, watch your step." Lieselotte's eyes snapped open. A man in a tan hat stood waiting, his sleeves rolled up to reveal sun-browned forearms. Dust coated his boots. He wasn't a soldier in a crisp uniform. He didn't carry a submachine gun or a truncheon. He looked like a farmer. Like a character from the Western films she'd seen in German cinemas before the war. A cowboy. Behind him, other American soldiers leaned on their rifles, but their posture was relaxed, almost bored. They watched without malice, their expressions more curious than hostile. As Lieselotte and the other women climbed down, hesitant and confused, there were no chains. No one pushed them. No one barked orders. The air smelled of horses, hay, and dry earth, not gunpowder and disinfectant. The cowboy extended his hand, not to grab her, but to offer a tin cup. It was filled with water. She took it, her hand trembling slightly. The water was cold, clean, and tasted of life. She drank it all at once, the simple act a shocking moment of relief. He just nodded. Plenty more where that came from. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a thirsty woman. This was the inciting incident. This was the first domino to fall. It was a tiny gesture, a cup of water, a polite phrase, but in the supercharged atmosphere of war and propaganda, it was a seismic event. It was the first piece of evidence that directly contradicted the entire narrative of American monstrosity. The monster she had been taught to fear wasn't there. In its place stood a man in a dusty hat, offering a kindness so simple, so uncalculated, that it was utterly disarming. As the gates of the facility closed behind them, Liselotte looked out not at guard towers and barbed wire, but at open plains stretching to an impossibly wide horizon. Windmills turned slowly in the distance. Cattle grazed lazily beyond a simple wooden fence. This wasn't a cage of steel and fire. It looked like a farm. That night, in a clean bunkhouse, she lay awake replaying the moment over and over. The calm voice, the cold water, the absence of hate. It didn't make sense. Was it a trick? Some new, sophisticated form of torture designed to break them psychologically before the real horror began? The alternative was too radical to comprehend. That everything she had been told, everything she had believed about the enemy, was a lie. For the first time since her capture, the iron grip of fear loosened just enough to allow a new feeling to seep in. A dangerous, destabilizing feeling. Curiosity. In the quiet darkness of the Texas night, a single, whispered thought echoed in her mind. This is America? The kindness Liselotte encountered was not an accident. It was the endpoint of a deeply pragmatic and remarkably sophisticated American strategy. To understand what happened on that Texas ranch, we must conduct an autopsy of the system that made it possible. By 1944, the United States had become the world's largest warden, holding over 400,000 Axis prisoners of war on its own soil. This presented a monumental logistical and philosophical challenge. The Nazi and Imperial Japanese regimes had demonstrated unspeakable brutality in their own camps, viewing prisoners as subhuman. America had a choice. It could mirror that brutality, or it could choose a different path. It chose the latter, adhering to the 1929 Geneva Conventions with an almost obsessive precision. This wasn't born from pure altruism. It was cold, calculated logic. First, treating German prisoners well gave the Nazi regime less justification for mistreating captured Allied soldiers. It was a form of diplomatic leverage. Second, and more importantly, military planners saw the POW population as a unique opportunity for psychological warfare. A prisoner who was fed, paid for his labor, and treated with decency was less likely to cause trouble. He required fewer guards. But the true masterstroke was the long-term vision. These men and women would eventually go home. If they returned with stories of American cruelty, they would fuel resentment and sow the seeds of future conflicts. But if they returned with stories of fairness and abundance, they would become unwilling ambassadors of the American way of life, living proof that the propaganda they'd been fed was a lie. Each well-treated prisoner was a small crack in the foundation of fascist ideology. This philosophy was implemented with the same industrial efficiency America applied to building tanks and bombers. More than 500 camps were established across the country, many in remote areas like Texas, where the vast, open spaces were ideal. Each camp operated like a small, self-contained city with libraries, infirmaries, workshops, and chapels. Prisoners received a daily caloric intake of over 3,000 calories, often more than American civilians, and certainly more than they ever received in the German army. They were paid 80 cents a day for their labor, money they could spend in camp canteens on items like Coca-Cola, cigarettes, and candy bars. To a German used to years of stringent rationing, this was an unimaginable luxury. The message was clear and devastatingly effective. Our prisoners eat better than your soldiers. Our system works. This system faced a new challenge with the arrival of female prisoners. Where to house them? How to employ them? The solution was found in the vast agricultural needs of Texas. With millions of American men serving overseas, the nation faced a critical labor shortage on its farms and ranches. German POWs filled that gap. And so Lieselotte and a few dozen other women were sent from the structured world of Camp Hearn to the far more informal environment of the Callahan Ranch. The rancher, Frank Callahan, wasn't a philosopher or a military strategist. He was a pragmatist who needed help running his cattle operation. To him, these women weren't ideological enemies. They were simply hands. His approach was brutally simple. You run, you'll die thirsty out there. You stay, you'll eat well and sleep easy. We're not your jailers. We're your neighbors till this war is done. This was the ripple effect in action. Official policy created the conditions, but it was the day-to-day interactions with ordinary Americans that brought the strategy to life. The first order of business on the ranch was not a lecture on democracy, but a breakfast of bacon, eggs, and biscuits so hot they burned your fingers. The women ate in stunned silence, waiting for a catch that never came. Then came the horses. The idea was practical. You can't herd cattle on foot. But the symbolic power was immense. A horse represents freedom, movement, and trust. To place a prisoner of war on horseback, outside the wire, was an act of profound confidence. The initial chaos of the riding lessons, the laughter of the cowboys, the shared struggle against a stubborn animal, all of it worked to dissolve the rigid categories of prisoner and guard. They were becoming simply people, working together. Lieselotte's diary from this period, a composite of letters and memories, captures this astonishing transformation. She wrote, "They trust us. It is madness, but also perhaps kindness disguised as madness. They treat us not as enemies, but as people. I do not understand this America." She observed the American attitude toward work. In Germany, labor was a grim duty to the state. Here, the cowboys infused it with pride, competition, and humor. They sang while they mended fences. They joked as they roped calves. Their authority came from competence, not from rank. The evenings by the campfire were another revelation. Music became a bridge across the chasm of war. One night, a cowboy began to hum Lily Marlene, the bittersweet melody beloved by German soldiers on every front. Instinctively, Lieselotte began to sing the German lyrics. Soon, other women joined in, their voices blending with the cowboy's hum. For a few minutes, under a canopy of stars, there were no enemies, only people sharing a song of longing and loss. The war, the ideology, the hatred, it all melted away in the face of a shared, simple humanity. The true test, the climax of their integration, came with the storm. A black wall of clouds rolled in from the west, unleashing a torrent of wind and rain. The cattle panicked, scattering across the open plains. Without a moment's hesitation, without an order being given, the German women ran for the horses. They mounted up and rode into the deluge alongside the cowboys, their shouts in German and English swallowed by the howling wind. For hours, they fought the storm together, a single, determined unit, driving the terrified animals back to the safety of the pens. Soaked, shivering, and exhausted, they returned victorious. Not a single animal was lost. That night, Frank Callahan walked among them, his face streaked with rain and pride. "Guess y'all ain't just city girls after all," he said, the highest compliment a rancher could give. The next morning, a hand-painted sign hung over their bunkhouse door. It read, "The German Cowgirls." Lieselotte looked at it and laughed until tears streamed down her face. It was a christening. They were no longer just prisoner number 742. They had an identity, a place. They belonged. The autopsy was complete. The propaganda had been dissected and found hollow. The ripple effect had transformed them. The war was still raging thousands of miles away, but on this small patch of Texas soil, it was already over. April 1945. The war in Europe was in its death throes. Berlin was a sea of fire. The Führer a ghost in his bunker. At the Callahan Ranch, the news arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet gravity of Frank Callahan holding a folded newspaper in the barn. "Ladies," he said, his voice low, "it's over. Germany surrendered." There was no cheering, no celebration, only a profound, echoing silence filled with the distant lowing of cattle. The war had been the central fact of their entire adult lives. Its sudden absence left a vacuum. Relief was tangled with grief, uncertainty, and a new, daunting question. What now? What was home? A pile of rubble? A divided country occupied by its conquerors? In the days that followed, the machinery of repatriation began to turn. U.S. Army trucks arrived to take the women back to the official camps to await transport to Europe. The departure was quiet and somber. As Lieselotte packed her few belongings, Frank approached her. He didn't offer platitudes about the future. Instead, with a playful grin, he handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a brand-new Stetson hat. "So, you don't forget Texas," he said. She put it on. It was too big. But as the cowboys whooped and hollered, she cried and laughed at the same time. The hat was more than a souvenir. It was a symbol of an impossible friendship, a token of a different way of life she had discovered in the most unlikely of places. It was the physical manifestation of American confidence. The journey home was a descent back into a broken world. The ship docked in Bremerhaven, a ghost city of skeletal buildings and mountains of debris. The air was cold, gray, and thick with the smell of defeat. But as they disembarked, American Red Cross workers handed each of them a small care package containing chocolate, canned goods, and coffee. Holding a Hershey bar while wearing a Texas cowboy hat on the ruins of the Third Reich was the final, surreal confirmation. The lie was dead. The propaganda had been utterly and completely annihilated by 1,000 small acts of decency. Lieselotte learned her family had perished. Her home was gone. But she was not broken. She carried the lesson of Texas within her. She found work as a translator for the Allied occupation forces, her cowboy English amusing the American officers. She told them her story, a story they could scarcely believe, of cattle drives and kindness. In 1948, she was invited to speak at a conference on post-war reconciliation. Standing before an audience of German and Allied women, she didn't talk about treaties or politics. She talked about Frank Callahan. She talked about learning to ride a horse. "I was a prisoner of war," she began, her voice steady. "But I never felt like one. I learned that freedom is not given by nations. It is given by people, one act of kindness at a time." Her story was not unique. Thousands of German prisoners returned home with similar tales of fair treatment, of abundance, of an enemy who refused to hate them. These men and women became the first, crucial human bridges between two shattered nations. They were the grassroots foundation upon which the Marshall Plan and the future NATO alliance would be built. They had seen the other side, and it was not the monster they'd been promised. Years later, Lieselotte Minhart would immigrate to the United States. She settled in San Antonio, Texas, and opened a small bakery. Above the counter, she hung a single faded photograph, a young woman in an oversized cowboy hat, standing next to a tall, smiling rancher. The inscription read simply, "From enemies to friends." The story of the German cowgirls teaches us a timeless lesson. True strength is not the power to dominate, but the confidence to be humane. It proves that empathy can be a strategic weapon, and that dignity can dismantle an ideology more effectively than any bomb. In the end, the quiet decency of ordinary people on a dusty Texas ranch did more to win the peace than any general or diplomat. Because the greatest victory isn't measured by the territory you conquer, but by the hearts you change. The history of the Second World War is filled with tales of epic battles and grand strategies, but sometimes the most powerful stories are found in the quietest moments. What do you think? Was this policy of decency a sign of American strength or a naive risk? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe these forgotten stories of history deserve to be told, please like this video and subscribe for more.